Okay, Chris, you got to shoot on an iPhone today.
You know how I feel about Apple though, Jordan? None of this makes sense to me. What do I hit camera? I get camera. Oh yeah, okay. Oh, like everything's so straight. Oh, actually, there's a really nice interface. Ooh, photo. Oh, it took a photo. Oh, it's pretty.
Welcome back, DP Review TV viewers. It's Jordan Drake here, as promised, to give you the review of my new phone, the Apple iPhone 13 Pro. Chris is actually going to film this entire video on it right now, so pay really close attention to the video quality. We're in cinematic mode right now, 30 frames per second. We'll talk about why a little bit later. But as well, this is a standard dynamic range video, but don't worry, if you want to know what the HDR footage looks like and you can play it back on an HDR TV or a phone or something like that, I'll put a link in the description to a little video montage that gives you some good sample images, give you an idea what the HDR capture from this camera looks like. I'm also just going to be looking at the built-in first-party apps for photo and video, because going outside to all the different third-party applications would just be outside the scope of this review. Okay, so let's talk about the three camera modules in the 13 Pro and 13 Pro Max. And Chris is actually going to be filming me on the lens that we're talking about. So let's start with the main camera, which is still a 26mm equivalent. It's a great focal length. But I was actually wrong when we did our 13 preview, because I said that we were getting the same camera lens combo from the 12 Pro Max across the entire iPhone 13 line. That's not the case. With the 13 Pro and 13 Pro Max, you're getting a brighter lens. It's f1.5 instead of 1.6, and we're getting a larger sensor as well, and that gives us some real benefits. So the combination of the brighter lens and the larger sensor means that when you're filming something up close, like Chris is doing right now, or taking pictures, you're going to get a nice kind of shallow depth of field look to the image without having to go into portrait mode and simulate that bokeh. It also means if you're shooting in lower light situations, you don't constantly have to use night mode. It actually does a pretty good job taking low light photos. I would have to say, out of all the upgrades on the Pro and Pro Max models, this was the biggest one. It's what really made me pick up the Pro. It might not be the best quality, but I've really been having a lot of fun with the ultra-wide lens, which has been around for quite a while. But before, I really found it to be a bit of a novelty, and it was a fairly dark lens and a very small sensor. Still a small sensor, but now it's a much brighter lens, so there's a lot less noise whenever you're using the ultra-wide. And the biggest upgrade for me is they've added autofocus to it, and it has an incredibly close minimum focus now. I'm really enjoying just being able to get that lens right up on top of your subject. Macro is something that's not easy to play with in smartphone photography, so it's really cool that they gave you the option. Finally, we've got the Telephoto module, and this is actually a 77mm equivalent focal length now, which I absolutely love. Just gives you a really nice compression for doing portraits, and I had a lot of fun actually shooting landscape photos with the longer lens, because you don't really worry about depth of field too much. Gives you a really nice, interesting perspective. But remember, this is the slowest of all the lenses on this camera, and still a really small sensor. I can tell immediately the difference in image quality coming from the main camera to the 77, so you've really got to want that look. Now, I find most of the time I'm always recomposing my shot so I can go back to the main camera, because both the ultra-wide and the telephoto, it's a big image quality hit, but honestly, it's just nice to have the option. If you're looking for a little more detail on all three of the camera modules, definitely check out Rishi Sanyal's super detailed article on dpreview.com. I'll provide a link in the description. So the last iPhone that we properly reviewed was the iPhone 11 Pro, and in that case, the portrait mode on it could sometimes give you some really excellent results, but I found I was constantly shooting like 3 or 4 images, and I'd be like, one of these isn't going to have a weird depth map issue, or hair is going to look bizarre or something like that. So you could certainly get good results, but you had to try a few times, where with the 13 Pro, the processing has improved so much, most of the time I'm finding it's doing a great job giving you that fake blurry background, but still keeping your subject without a lot of odd blurriness all around hair. And don't forget, you can always just shoot your picture in portrait mode, and then afterwards choose the depth of field that's going to work best for that shot. I've been doing that a lot, and I'm really enjoying the results. Just like portrait mode, night mode is also enormously improved, and I mean, it's going to be because we've got larger sensor, brighter lens. That's going to make a big difference. But I also think they've really tweaked the algorithm. I find it still has a nice amount of contrast, where night mode shots could look very, very flat before. I always found myself tweaking them. They look great straight out of camera in this mode. Now I'm really looking forward to doing like some astrophotography, some night work, and if you want to see some of that, you should probably just follow me on Instagram. Just alongside the beautiful river here is a great place for us to talk about video. And if my social media ads are any indication, Apple really wants you to know that they have the new cinematic mode. Now what this is, it's very similar to portrait mode when you're taking pictures, where it's taking a depth map of the image and using that to build shallow depth of field that should look quite convincing in real time, but now it's doing it at 30 frames per second. Shallow depth of field in video is something that smartphones just haven't been able to do, and it's a big part of why a lot of people are still buying big chip cameras, is because they want that shallow depth of field in video. So if Apple can pull this off, this could be an absolute game changer for the industry, and I was very impressed with their initial ads, so I was very curious to try this feature out myself. As soon as the iPhone 13 Pro arrived, I went out, switched it to cinematic mode, shot as many shallow depth of field video clips as I possibly could, then I ran home, stuck it on my computer, took a look at the footage, and it was like having a fork dragged across my eyeballs. Why would you make me watch this?
You keep looking at that computer screen, Jordan.
No. It's the worst.
No,
it's
this
terrible.
is Apple's new cinematic mode. Everybody loves it. You're gonna love it.
Oh, it's
too.
horrible. No, I don't want to.
Wait, no. You look at that screen.
No.
Jordan, all you have to do is tell us what you think about this, and it can all be over.
I don't like it. Okay. It is not literal torture watching footage shot in the cinematic mode, and it does a lot right. The way it handles bokeh in the foreground and background does look very natural. If you're doing focus pulls from mid distances, it looks very smooth, very convincing, and the interface is actually quite intuitive when you're doing it. But the big problem is, it's when you've got those transition areas from in focus to out of focus. If that's right on your subject, it can be incredibly distracting. I mean, look at this clip where I'm talking here. We've got a chain link fence right behind me, and we've got areas that should be on the same plane where part of it's in focus and part of it's out of focus. Or with my daughter here, where her ponytail's right in the middle of her head, her entire head is in focus, except for that ponytail on top. It can look very weird and extremely distracting. Especially when your subject and the camera is moving, like in a walk and talk, you get these weird halos all around your subject. It looks so distracting. I was so disappointed in the phone. It's like, that's it, you're going back to the store, iPhone 13. But before I did that, I thought maybe I'll try stopping things down a little bit, and that improves them enormously. Like, Chris, I think right now you're shooting at 2.8. Let's try stopping the lens down a little bit. So now that we're stopped down to f8, the depth of field is covering my entire body, so we're not seeing that weird transition weirdness on my face, and we still have an out of focus background. So this is when I like using cinematic mode, stop down a little bit. Now one thing I love with this is, just like in portrait mode, you can adjust the depth of field afterwards. So I would record a cinematic clip and then expand the depth of field until my subject was nice and sharp, soft out of focus background, and in those cases it actually looks really pleasing. Also, if you're looking to find out how to fix focus issues even in post when you're using cinematic mode, Rishi Sanyal has an article with some video examples coming out very shortly. Keep an eye on dpreview.com for that. So I want to show you one last thing. We've disabled cinematic mode and we're just shooting with the main camera with that brighter lens and bigger sensor, and it is giving us some fairly shallow depth of field. It actually doesn't look dramatically different from the cinematic mode at f8, but if you look at the two side by side, you can see the cinematic mode is a little bit shallower depth of field, and this background bokeh is much softer, much smoother. The real thing though is, remember, if you switch over to cinematic mode, it's 1080 30p only. Is it worth sacrificing 4K and various frame rates to get that smoother background? I mean, that's a tough decision, but you have options. Look, I review cameras for a living, so while this is a revolutionary technology and there's been a ton of work going into it, I'm not going to cut Apple a break in terms of the final image quality. There are still some very real issues with it. That said, I've also seen some examples from Samsung smartphones trying to simulate the same thing, and those are dog shit. I mean, you've got like pulsing, out of focus weirdness. Apple's is pristine by comparison. But there are still some very real image quality issues, and I'm certainly going to point those out. But I also want to say that whenever I showed this to people who aren't camera reviewers, they were actually really impressed with how good the footage looked, especially playing it back on the beautiful HDR display on this. It looks fantastic. And if you're doing like Instagram stories or TikTok videos or things like that where quality isn't of the absolute essence, I think this is a pretty cool little effect to be able to play around with, and people will get some good use out of it. Okay, so let's turn cinematic mode off for a little bit and just go back to the wonder of the basic camera on this. Chris is thrilled. He's got 3 different lens choice options again. This is the best video quality I have ever seen out of a smartphone. Especially using the HDR modes on this, you get tons of dynamic range in 24, 30, and 60 frames per second, and you've got that beautiful HDR display for previewing it on. It just looks very vivid, very lifelike, and one thing that I've had a lot of issues with in previous iPhones is that high contrast scenes, skin tones can get really weird. That is not the case with this phone. Whether you're in SDR or HDR, skin tones are still very pleasant and color looks great. Okay, so let's imagine a situation where you're about to have the best barbecue in all of Calgary at Hayden Block, and you notice, hey, it's pretty low light. How's the video going to perform in those situations? Well, low light video is the one thing where the phone definitely still has a real disadvantage. The iPhone can't do a lot of those computational tricks that it does for photography, where it's stacking a whole bunch of images. So you are certainly going to notice some noise, a loss in detail. For an example, I recorded this in my basement. My regular camera was metering out at f2.8, a 50th of a second at 800 ISO, and here you can see the image from the phone is just very noisy, a lack of detail. I mean, it's the best we've seen from an iPhone, as you can see right now, but it's still a smartphone, and in low light, it's not a great video tool. All right, let's talk about stabilization in video mode. And Chris is going to follow me down this rickety hill. Should be a really nice test of that. And the iPhones have had very good stabilization for a while, but now they're actually stabilizing on the sensor with your main camera. And the results are extremely good. Now, one thing to remember is when you're actually filming or taking photos, you're not going to see the full effect of the stabilizer, so you might think the footage is wobblier than it actually is. It's when you play it back that you'll see the effect, and it is very good. With the new skin tones on this phone, I could actually see, whoa, using this phone as a walk and talk camera. I should look where I'm going. Anyways, it's good, and I survived. I remember when the iPhone 13 series were first announced, we saw so many reaction pieces of like, you know, these are just minor upgrades with some interesting features. But I really disagree. Unless you were one of the lucky people who had an iPhone 12 Pro Max, which was a really big, expensive phone, then you're seeing a huge upgrade across the board on the iPhone 13 series. And in every one of the new camera modules, there's something compelling that makes it a dramatically better camera than it was before. Everyone's talking about the cinematic mode, and I understand why. And this is a feature that we've all been waiting for a very long time. We all like shallow depth of field when we're shooting video, and we wanted to see it in a smartphone. But I've used it extensively, Chris has used it a lot, and we decided to just shoot in the standard 4K mode, which still has, you know, a fairly shallow depth of field given the sensor that we've got in this camera. It looks quite nice, and honestly, it's so hit or miss using cinematic mode. Sometimes it looks good, but a lot of times it's just distracting, terrible looking footage coming off of it. Now remember, way back 5 years ago, when Apple first brought out portrait mode, we heard similar things. It was often very distracting, but once in a while you'd get a good looking portrait off of it. And I think we're going to do the exact same thing here with cinematic mode. It's going to get progressively better as processing improves. But for right now, I'm enjoying all the other camera upgrades on the iPhone 13, and I'm looking forward to what's going to happen with cinematic mode in the future. Thanks so much for joining us. And remember, there's some very exciting looking Android cameras right on the horizon. So I think that'll be in our future, and you're definitely going to want to subscribe if you want to check that out. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us, and I will see you all again soon with more DP Review TV.